introduce Leslie Carpenter, and she's a longtime serious brain disorders advocate and good friend of NAMI, Iowa, and she's going to be our moderator for this session. And again, I just want to reiterate, if you have questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A box. And if you have any technical issues, please put them in the chat and our producer can help you out. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leslie.
Thank you very much, Heather, and thank you to Zach for the tech support. We really appreciate that. Today, I have the wonderful pleasure of being able to introduce you to three wonderful panelists, Norm Ornstein, Kevin Fischer, and Judge Patrick McElyea. I'm going to go ahead and let each of them introduce themselves by way of answering a question during their introduction as well. And I'm going to start with Norm Ornstein. I'd like to ask you if you could tell us about your reasons for producing the film, The Definition of Insanity, that covers the work of Judge Steve Leifman in Miami-Dade County, and share your insights about why we should be replicating his model throughout the country.
Sure, Leslie, thanks, and great to be with you. So my history here, which is similar to many others, including Leslie's, is of course built on a family tragedy, a family experience. I'm a political scientist who's mostly focused on national politics and governance. I had a son named Matthew, a brilliant young man, a national champion high school debater, went to Princeton, excelled, was out in Hollywood, and at age 24, had a breakdown, a psychotic episode, and went through a 10-year struggle with serious mental illness combined with anosognosia. He had no insight into his illness and unwillingness to get any treatment. Matthew believed that he had been, that God had come and taken his soul, but not his body. And he was on a struggle to find out why and to get it back. And taking medication or any kind of treatment would short circuit that process. And we encountered for 10 years an insane mental health system. And eventually, almost 6 years ago, at age 34, Matthew died accidentally of carbon monoxide poisoning in a motel room where he was staying because they had a smoking room. And like so many people with serious mental illness, he smoked heavily. And that made him a double pariah in the eyes of society. In the aftermath of our tragedy, we formed a foundation in his memory, the Matthew Harris Ornstein Memorial Foundation, mornstein.org for anybody interested. And we looked for ways of turning grief to purpose. We began to study the mental health system. Our own encounters had been frustrating and very difficult. And along the way, we encountered Judge Steve Leifman of Miami-Dade County, Florida. We became friends, went down to Miami, immersed ourselves in what he was doing. And we're, frankly, my wife and I were blown away by the ways in which he had found to transform the criminal justice system. And as it deals with people with serious mental illness, Miami has the largest concentration in the country, perhaps not surprisingly, because the climate, people go down there. If you're homeless, it's a lot easier than being in Iowa, especially during the winter months. But there's also an easy availability of drugs. And of course, the large portion of them are dual diagnosis of those who have a serious mental illness. And Judge Leifman found ways to save lives and save money, creating a very different system. And we decided that the best thing that we could do was to produce this documentary that would show what he does in action, focusing on the people involved, the people caught up in the system and those remarkable people working with him, and then use it as a kind of springboard to take around the country and share best practices. And what's so striking about it is that you can take people, as Judge Leifman says so eloquently, they're just like everybody else. They want to have good lives, stable lives, lives that are rich, and that you can find ways to make that happen for many. And so we produced the film. It aired on PBS on April 14th. It's now available for anybody to watch in two forms, a longer and more nuanced theatrical version and the PBS version at doifilm.com. We've been short-circuited by the pandemic from taking it to Iowa and other places directly. I hope that will not last forever or for a long time, but we're finding other ways to interact with communities. Every community is different. Every state is different. You have different needs. You have different resources. But there are some common themes and common ways of dealing with this set of problems. I would just end this early portion by saying that my son's interactions with the criminal justice system were fairly limited. He did have one instance where he was in a manic phase driving in New Jersey, driving, I think, for probably 24 straight hours. And he was stopped by police in the middle of the night. He was, as best we can tell, pretty belligerent about it. I know my rights. I was not doing anything wrong. And he happened to, just by good fortune, have police who understood that this was somebody in the throes of a mental illness episode, called a professional, and he got sent to a hospital instead of being tased, shot, sent to jail, or worse. But we know that for so many others, it's a much different experience. And every day or every week, we find examples, Rochester recently, Chicago recently, but so many everywhere where the experience is a tragic one. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you, Norm. I appreciate you sharing that. Next, I'd like to introduce Kevin Fischer, who is the Executive Director of NAMI Michigan. And Kevin, my question to you is, can you tell us about your role in Michigan and also the experience that you have with mental health courts there in Michigan?
So first of all, thank you for having me. As the Executive Director for NAMI, of course, one of my leading responsibilities is in advocacy. And so I spend a lot of time with the legislature advocating for rights and access to services. And one of those provisions happens to be assisted outpatient treatment, or in Michigan, it goes by the name Kevin's Law. So I spend a lot of time explaining to people that it's not named after me, but AOT has been here in Michigan since 2004. I have the privilege of working with Judge Milton Mack here, who is, he calls himself retired, but he's failed at it about as miserably as I have. I literally just got off the phone with him about 15 minutes ago. But Judge Mack is a tremendous advocate for persons living with mental illness, specifically in mental health crisis. He and our former Lieutenant Governor, Brian Calley, have done a fantastic job having AOT language revised to make it more user-friendly. And I'm sure we'll get into that a little later. Also, of course, as Mr. Ornstein, and I want to extend my condolences to you, sir. Like Mr. Ornstein, I came to NAMI with lived experience. My oldest son, Dominique, was diagnosed bipolar schizophrenic in 2007, very similar to your case, sir. It was a complete surprise to his mom and I. He was a sophomore in college and doing very well, and came home and just the wheels came off. And unfortunately, after getting him into treatment and thinking we were doing well, on June 27th of 2010, we lost my son to suicide. And part of that process, I knew nothing about assisted outpatient treatment, just being a parent and caregiver, flailing, trying to understand the provisions and the tools available in the public behavioral health system. Could not get the help that I needed for my son. And again, we'll get into that later. But that's what makes AOT so important to me. And I'm glad that I have the support of advocates like Judge Mack and former Lieutenant Governor Calley, who are helping us push this through and make it more user-friendly for people. So thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. And next, I'm going to introduce Judge Patrick McElyea, who actually is a judge from the Scott County Mental Health Court. I had the privilege of observing the Scott County Mental Health Court a couple of times, but that was before Judge McElyea was there. So I'm very interested to hear about your experience with the Criminal Mental Health Court there, and if you've had experience with other problem-solving courts prior to that.
Sure. Like everyone else, thank you very much for the invitation and for allowing me to be a part of this. Helping folks in our communities that battle mental illness is something that's very important to me, both personally and professionally. Unfortunately, we see far too many folks sitting in our jails and our prison system that those end up being the mental health providers in our community. And you know, we're all trying to fight that battle to increase resources. Excuse me. I took over full-time as the mental health court judge, sort of as the pandemic kind of came on, in some respects due to comfort with technology, and in some respects as we were transitioning. The philosophy that we have in the 7th Judicial District, which encompasses sort of middle eastern Iowa, so Clinton to Muscatine, and then as far west as Tipton, is to try to rotate the judges through the specialty courts so that, one, everybody gets a chance to be involved, and two, I think, you know, it takes a lot of energy and a lot of work, and so I think to bring some folks in that may have a renewed fire or vigor or whatnot. And so I was very lucky to get to take this over from Judge Smith, who got it going. I think they had it going in around 2008, 2009, and then when state budget cuts came, we lost it, and then we started it back up again in 2016. And you know, it's been a great experience. We've weathered the pandemic really well. We've been doing virtual court for the last 4 or 5 months, and our participants, I think, enjoy being able to see one another, even if it's just virtually. We had a graduation on October 30th where we had not only our first female graduate, but we had 3 female graduates. And you know, speaking to the advocacy piece that we all are aware of, you know, had a few legislators that came to partake in that, so that they can see where those dollars are going and what kind of program is happening. In the 7th, we have a drug court as well. So that's our other specialty court that deals with substance abuse. I think if I had my druthers, the long-term goal would be that they have a very symbiotic relationship so that we can deal with folks who battle with substance abuse and mental health, dual diagnosis, because oftentimes one of the biggest hurdles that we run into is, you know, which sort of end of the spectrum does this fall on? Is someone battling more mental illness or substance abuse? Are they self-medicating? What's the situation? And I think, you know, combining some of those tools, combining some of those resources will be helpful. Another thing I'm very proud of for the Iowa Judicial Branch is that we recently hired a specialty court coordinator to coordinate specialty courts throughout the state. And so I think that gives us another kind of hub to work off of, share resources, things like that. Yeah.
Thank you. So here in the 6th Judicial District, we are working, I'm kind of the unofficial family member nudger to create a civil mental health court. In Iowa, for those of you that don't know, we currently have 5 criminal mental health courts, but I am pretty determined to create a civil mental health court because I believe we should be providing this level of help and collaborative care with the assisted outpatient treatment team to people sooner rather than later, before they actually get so sick that they end up intersecting with the criminal justice system. And we, thankfully, we have met with Dr. Eric Howard, and he is working with us actively on the team to help us be sure that we're going to institute best practices and the sequential intercept model. But I'm interested in all of your opinions about civil versus criminal? Do you believe in having both available to help people that have serious brain disorders along with anosognosia where they do not know they're sick? And I will let you just jump in, if you don't mind, to answer that.
Well, for me, the short answer is yes. We should not have to wait for a person to commit a crime to get the help that they need. And as the judge mentioned, unfortunately, our jails and prisons have become the de facto mental health treatment facilities across the country, and that's unfortunate. So anytime we have an opportunity to help someone, whether they recognize their need for help or not, anytime we have an opportunity to help someone before they become engaged with the criminal justice system, I think benefits the entire community all around.
Thank you.
I couldn't agree more. And, you know, we have some headwinds that we have to deal with. There are large numbers of people, activists in our area who push back against this. The consumer survivor movement is a strong one. I'm very cognizant of and sensitive to civil liberties issues. But those of us who have dealt with people with anosognosia, who understand that once you get past 18, if you refuse treatment because you have no insight into your illness, the outcome is likely to be a tragic one. It may be an outcome like the ones that Kevin and I have experienced as parents, and we don't want anybody else to have to go through that. It can be a struggle that goes on for years or decades, where you just have no ability to do anything. You're powerless. And we know that if you have sensitivity to the civil liberties questions, if you don't take us back to an older era where, you know, I've been reading these two wonderful books, Insane by Elisa Roth, about the tragedies of the prison system and how it deals with those with criminal justice, and the book Waiting for an Echo by Christine Montross, a psychiatrist. You see what happens when people who have no insight into their illnesses get into the criminal justice system if it's not done with sensitivity, as it is in some of the mental health courts. And if we're not going to be able to treat people, we're going to head down the path where they're free to die in the criminal justice system or by suicide, or free to be homeless and possibly even freeze to death. That's not the kind of freedom we should have. And we know that AOT, if it's done the right way, works. And I would just add, it has to be done the right way. You know, when I first mentioned this, the first thing that I wrote when I decided that I needed to get involved with this, and I wrote a piece that was in the New York Times back when Congress was foundering over what became the 21st Century's Cures Act. Some of the responses that I got were, I was put on AOT, and all that happened was somebody came by once a week to dispense meds, to drop them off. That's not appropriate. But if you do this the right way with compassion and with strength, we know it works. We know that there are many people who can recapture their lives. And that's what we need to see happening. And in states where they have no AOT, it's worse. It's just worse for people.
And I think, you know, in Iowa, at least, I think the biggest hurdle in a lot of ways is resources for providers. And, you know, I think we can all come up with a framework to create a situation where folks can be ordered to complete certain parts of treatment, but if those treatment providers aren't there or aren't being compensated for their services in a way that they need to, you know, that's, I mean, one of the biggest hurdles that we have through the court system is, you know, obviously we get to use Medicaid, which is huge, but, you know, the amount of paperwork and time that we have to spend working on paying for and arranging for services, you know, if that energy could be put into our clients and our participants, it would be so much more fruitful.
I concur. Toward that end, I want you to know that there are voices, including mine, probably the loudest one, about increasing reimbursement rates. And I would also make the point that what I have seen is that for providers, the very patients that we're talking about, who are the revolving door patients going in and out of the hospital, in and out of being arrested, these are the patients that are the most difficult for the providers to provide services for. And actually having a half-day docket with a judge supervising a treatment team working together actually makes it easier for those providers to provide the services to the patient. And I've observed this work very well in both criminal and civil mental health courts. And it actually ends up saving everybody money in the end, in addition to, more importantly, saving those lives. And Norm, you brought up the very question that I was going to ask about, you know, the people that push back about infringing upon people's civil rights. And I would just like to share that I've had conversations with people from those groups who started approaching me on Twitter. And what I have learned is that they are not advocating for the very same types of patients that we are for the most part. They don't have an understanding of just how sick my son and your sons probably were. And that is a huge thing that we have as an opportunity to educate them, to help bring them along in their understanding of just how seriously ill some people are, and that we would never intend for this to be utilized for somebody that just has depression, right? It is for somebody who's very seriously ill and at risk of dying if we don't intervene. And I would also, go ahead.
No, just one of the interesting experiences that Judge Leifman has had when he first did the deep dive into the data down there, there were 97 people, primarily homeless and schizophrenic, who were out on the streets and were going through the system on a regular basis. They get picked up because they were out in front of stores and swept in, spend a couple of months in jail, mostly in solitary, the worst thing you can do for somebody with a serious mental illness. And then they just dump them back out onto the streets. Sometimes they give them $10 or a cab ride somewhere, and they'd be back. And what they found was these 97 people cost the county $14.7 million over 5 years, for which they got absolutely nothing. And they're now moving to a different form of treatment, including AOT, with the long-term injectables. They're finding that for a large number of them, it has a huge impact. They get some insight, and then it's not like people say, gee, what I would really like to do is spend my life sitting out on the streets, homeless, and then spending 2 months in solitary, and then back out on the streets. What a wonderful way to live one's life. If you don't have an understanding that this is happening because people are sick and have no insight, they have a brain disease. It's an organ disease, and we have to recognize it as a brain disease, that we have to deal with it. And once you get people, in many cases, able to have some insight, then you can move to a different path and form of treatment. One other point I would make is I have some sympathy for police who don't know what they're doing in many cases, and we need to train them. But when they do, and they end up with people who have a real problem, they have no other option often but to take them to jail, which is a really bad option. And we have to provide those other options. And what Leifman's experience shows is if you make the initial investment, you save a lot of money besides saving lives.
Exactly. And that leads me to the very next question that I have is about that initial investment to get a court going. I'm aware that in Scott County, it was started through a foundation, the Genesis Foundation, I believe, with about $74,000. Judge McElyea, I'm interested to know if you feel, and I know I've seen some of the early outcome data, but I wonder if you could share some of the further outcome data about whether that you've gotten a very good return on that investment or not.
Certainly. We have, is the short answer. So we've tried to produce a brochure the last 2 years to provide to legislators and other community members that summarize the program, and I'm happy to send those out to you afterwards as sort of a template, both from an advocacy standpoint and just from a informational standpoint. As of May of 19, we'd spent $227,000 and avoided $594,000. So we'd saved $367,000. And this year, as of February of 2020, we'd spent 285 and avoided 712, saving taxpayers $427,000. You know, and I think we all know two things speak to legislators: money and anecdotes, real stories. Sometimes it's emotional and hard to tell those stories, but you know, they need to see that. They need to hear about the people that we see on a daily basis, because you know, as Norm was talking, one of the things that frustrated me was, and I'll sort of play the law role here, of you have to pay attention when some of these things go through your local legislators. We passed a law here a few years ago in Iowa that allows the providers, the doctors, when somebody's committed, they don't have to necessarily have a hearing. The doctor can just basically file a letter that says this person is no longer needs treatment here at the hospital, and the way the law is written, it says the court shall basically discharge them from that commitment. So we don't have any discretion, we don't have any ability. So you get those frequent flyers, and maybe the doctor just doesn't want to deal with them, and so files the letter, and we have to let them out, and that just only increases that revolving door. And that's a pretty subtle law that I think John Q. Public isn't going to pay a whole lot of attention to. I'm sure the medical community fought pretty hard for it, but I think we as mental health advocates need to be aware of subtleties like that impact our system.
The insurance community probably fought hard for it as well.
Yep.
Well, and if we could go back for just a second to what Norm was discussing, I like to use the analogy when we talk about members of the public pushing back on AOT and from the position that we may be infringing on civil liberties. And as an advocate, my major priority is to protect the rights of everyone. But I use this analogy because I'm an old Star Trek fan. And Mr. Spock said, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one. And one of the things that we don't like to talk about as mental health advocates is the fact that untreated mental illness can be very dangerous. It leads to suicide. It potentially leads to homicide. And we have a responsibility to society as a whole, in addition to the individuals. And I think that gets missed. You know, here in I'm just outside Detroit, Michigan. 2018, we lost a 25-year-old police officer to a man who was in crisis. The officer responded as a domestic violence call, and upon arrival, that officer was shot and killed. And what struck me was that the very first interview that I saw with the accused wife, the first thing she said was, my husband was in mental health crisis. He was off his medication, and I did not know how to help him. And while I cannot specifically say AOT would have saved this officer's life, I know it could have if his spouse understood its availability. So again, we absolutely want to protect the rights of the individuals, but we have to look at society as a whole. And then mental health courts have been tremendously successful. What Judge Leifman was able to prove down in Miami, and we call it the Miami-Dade project, they were able to save $20 million, close their largest jail, and now convert it to a holistic behavioral health treatment facility. That's phenomenal. That is absolutely phenomenal, and that's something that we cannot, as a society, turn our backs on. One other really quick point that Norm brought up was officers who have to interact with people who are in mental health crisis on a regular basis. Many of us are aware of CIT, or Crisis Intervention Team training, which is the basis, really, or a strong part of what they were able to accomplish down in Miami-Dade. These programs have to work together. I know, Leslie, you mentioned the sequential intercept mapping, but all of these tools come together to deliver and produce better outcomes, not only for the people who are living with a mental health diagnosis, but society as a whole. And we cannot sell that short.
Thank you for making that point. I'd like to make another point from a friend of mine, Eric Smith, who lives with a serious mental illness and is a graduate of the AOT program down in San Antonio, Texas. He talks about the fact that he would always want to have the right to be freed from the horrible condition of his own psychosis. And I think his ability to tell his story is really helpful in terms of helping to address the concerns of some people. The other thing I would say is that, yes, it is absolutely important for people to share their true stories. And I will share with you that our son has a schizoaffective disorder, and he just got released on Wednesday from his 22nd hospitalization. And unfortunately, he has not had the opportunity to have an assisted outpatient treatment program. But goodness, can we not imagine what it would be if after the 7th or 8th time he had stopped taking his medication, he'd been allowed to access this type of treatment program, or maybe the 10th time or the 15th time. We need to be able to provide these services sooner to so many more people who truly need them. So I'll just stop and not share a whole lot more, but you all have been making very good points. I can see, Heather, do you have any questions ready from the Q&A?
Yes, actually, first of all, there's a lot of thank yous to the whole panel for all of your answers and the resources that you're providing. I wonder, just because some of what we've been talking about is very high level, I wonder if you can suggest any resources that people might go to learn more about the sequential intercept model, as well as if you can further explain what anosognosia is, and I apologize if I mispronounced that.
Sure. I would go ahead and offer the description of what anosognosia is. There are changes that occur within the brain for probably up to at least 50% of people that have schizophrenia, bipolar, or schizoaffective disorder, changes within the frontal and parietal lobes of the brain that make the person completely unaware of their own illness. It is not like a diabetic denying that they're sick and not wanting to take his or her insulin. It is outright complete inability to recognize that they are sick in the first place. And then sequential intercept mapping, it sounded like Kevin, perhaps maybe you could help address that information.
I'm sorry, I'm muted and I'm reading chats, which I shouldn't be doing.
Sorry.
So, you know, I do better when I have the sequential intercept mapping in front of me, but basically, and anybody else can jump in, it is intercepts where we can catch people who are experiencing mental health crisis and bring them into the system before, and as a matter of fact, here in Michigan, we're working toward Intercept 0, where we catch people before they interface in the criminal justice system and get them to the help that they need. Because again, we know that, and I think Judge was hitting on this, one, jail is no place for mental health treatment. No one's really getting effective mental health treatment in jail. The other issue is it is the most expensive place to try to provide treatment. In Michigan, we spent over $30 million in 2 years on people who had been put in jail for committing minor crimes or misdemeanor crimes. And they couldn't make bail because typically people who are in mental health crisis are lower income and don't have access to resources. And it's, again, as to the judge's point, this is something that I really struggle with why legislators don't get it, because normally if you put something in front of a legislator and say, this is where you can save millions of dollars, they get it. But this is one of those areas that makes it really, really difficult. So I didn't answer in a subsequential model very well, but if you want to jump in, I appreciate it.
Let me just add one point on anosognosia that I know lots of people struggle to try and figure out what it is and what it means. And I sometimes use the analogy of think of a person with anorexia, and you say to that person, my God, you're skeletal. And the response is, are you kidding? Look how fat I am. Because the brain for that person is not working. It's showing something that is simply not a reality. And if you tell that person you need to eat more, you're not going to get the response that you want. And you're not going to get it, not because somebody is willfully starving themselves, but because their brain is not allowing them to understand what reality is. And that's what we see with people with a serious mental illness with anosognosia. And I would just, if we're, the sequential intercept model, I would say is simply, it's looking at all the elements of the system and how they're working together. And that's the key here, that every part, we can't do patchwork solutions now. We have to look at every part of this system, and it is the system of how we deal with people who have brain diseases, but it's also with the system of criminal justice. And that includes cash bail. It includes a reality that many people who have a serious mental illness are going to get picked up for something that isn't going to put them in a mental health court, that may be unrelated directly to their mental illness. But the response is they'll end up in jail because they can't make bail, and that'll get them in a worse situation. And when eventually they get out, they're going to be in a worse place, and it's going to cost the society so much more to have to deal with it. One other point I would make, as we talk about the interactions with police and the crisis intervention team policing, and here again, if you give people a day's training, it's not going to make any difference. You need to give them the full week, but you need to follow up as well. And one of the side effects here, I should note, is that in Miami-Dade, they're getting 250 calls a month into their mental health crisis hotline for the person who does the CIT training from police officers. Of course, there's an enormous amount of not just PTSD, but depression. More police officers died of suicide last year than in the line of duty. And if we don't deal with those issues, we're going to end up in a worse situation. But what we also know is that because of the way crisis intervention training worked with police in Miami, they cut the number of police shootings dramatically, and they were able to improve their bond rating in the city of Miami because of all the wrongful death and wrongful assault lawsuits that they didn't have to deal with anymore. It's kind of a backdoor way of a huge cost to taxpayers that people don't realize, that if you could avoid it, not only would you have fewer people being shot, but you'd also end up saving a lot of money.
Thank you.
Well,
go ahead.
I'm sorry, forgive me. I want to jump in because Norm made me think of something. You know, I am actually a CIT coordinator and trainer here in the state of Michigan. And I can tell you, with the number of officers that we have trained, so many have no idea what resources are available. They know nothing about AOT. They know nothing about sometimes where the crisis centers are in their communities. But when they are educated about those resources, and the judge mentioned earlier, frequent flyers, we like to use the term familiar faces here in Michigan. But when officers realize that I can take a person to get help and it will overall improve their quality of life, and sometimes not initially, but over a period of time, reduce the number of times that officer has to interact with that person again, law enforcement officers really buy into this program. So that is something that we need to keep on the forefront. I know funding is an issue there, and I know that there are some, what do we call them, old school hook 'em and book 'em law enforcement officers or administrators who haven't quite bought in to CIT yet, but we need to, because again, at the end of the day, we're improving the quality of life. We're saving lives. To Norm's point, the last statistics I saw regarding CIT was in the communities where it's utilized. And I think right now there's only about 2,700 of the 17,000 law enforcement agencies in the country that utilize CIT. But where it's been utilized, the incidence of injury to officers and civilians have been reduced by almost 80%. So again, that's improving officer safety, that's improving community safety, it's saving lives, and it is improving the quality of life for people who find themselves in mental health crisis.
Thank you. I just want to address one of the questions that was put up that was making a comment that depression is also serious and results in people dying. I absolutely agree. When I was saying that we really aren't usually considering people with depression for these types of courts, I was referring to the fact that most of the time people living with depression know that they're depressed and go ahead and cooperate and engage in their treatment. And for the most part, most of the courts that we're talking about are dealing with people with other diagnoses because of that change in the brain where they are not aware. But very much depression is real, anxiety is real, and we care and advocate for everybody and every mental illness. And Heather, more questions?
Yeah, we actually have a couple questions that I think are fairly similar and kind of tie into each other. So one was in Q&A and one was in the chat. And going with the Q&A one, this has to do with parents trying to get assistance for a child, and I believe it's probably an adult child. But then there's some similarities to a nurse or some sort of healthcare practitioner working with an adult client and having multiple commitments and struggling with that. So for the parent, this person says, we've had frustrations as it wasn't easy to have our child go back to the hospital when he didn't comply. I was told that I had to recommit him within 30 days. What is the purpose of a court order if nothing is done when we reach out? It's hard enough for a parent to commit a child the first time. And then additionally, for those healthcare providers, when you're in a situation where somebody has said that they're suicidal or having ideations, could possibly have, or there's been a assessment of the risk of harm done, and it's possible, you know, what resources are there for a healthcare provider to act on that as well?
Judge McElyea, would you like to take that on since this is talking about something specific to Iowa?
Sure. You know, and I can't necessarily give a ton of advice regarding, you know, the specifics there, but I think, you know, our mental health committal process has some nuance to it. I think, again, going back to some of our discussions about resources, there's certainly a bent towards trying to have folks address their needs outpatient for a variety of reasons. You know, resources, overall health, any number of factors. And so, unfortunately, I think that can result in what seems like maybe a little bit of a hands-off approach, but is really more just, you know, we depend, I think our civil side really depends on whether it's family members or other providers kind of keeping everybody informed. And I would just encourage folks who have had those frustrations to continue to work on building relationships with people, maybe at the county level, who are involved with the civil commitment side, because you know, this kind of dovetails back in with the conversation about knowing what programs or resources are out there. I recall a story not too long ago where there was a group in Iowa that tried to put together a book that had everything in it, but you know, the services would change so often that it became pointless to try to put together this book. And so, you know, I've often thought about websites or things that are easier to update, but it's confusing for those of us who are involved in the system, much less folks who are, you know, maybe have a loved one who's involved or this is the first experience that they have. So I think I would reach out to folks at the county level in Iowa, because that's kind of where things are controlled, and they will know of resources, they will know of programs. And I think when they know you as a parent, let's say in this situation, they'll know how to keep you informed and act in the best interest of your loved one if they can. And you know, again, I think these are the issues when we have adults, right? There's only so many things that we can force folks to do in certain situations. So I guess I would say I'm sorry that it's been frustrating. I know that that's a pretty common refrain, and that's part of the reason for our panel is to try to set up a system that is less frustrating and less bifurcated and less confusing to navigate.
Let me make a couple of comments. One is, if you, for all of those out there, if you have a child who's under 18, don't wait. Act while you have the power. Early intervention, we know now works. Don't go into denial that it's something less than you think it is. If there are warning signs, try and deal with it early. The second is, my wife actually had what I think is a terrific idea, which is that we get laws that before you can get a driver's license, you have to sign over a medical power of attorney to your parents. Most kids, you know, are going to go for that driver's license. They're not going to pay any attention to it. And while they can rescind it at any point once they're 18, there's a lot of inertia that comes in with these things. And if parents had the ability, even at least to be able to access medical records, we had experiences where we knew that my son was in a hospital and they wouldn't tell us that he was in the hospital. They wouldn't give us any information. They hide behind HIPAA in a way that often is far beyond what the law actually does provide, but the law also is an impediment. But if we can find ways to give parents more traction in this process, it's going to be helpful.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I'm trying to be very brief. Here in Michigan, because AOT has gone through an evolution in Michigan, I think we're on our third iteration and working on our fourth. And the very first, when we first signed into law 2004, it said that a person basically had to have a history of mental health crisis. And what that meant basically is, I call it a fail first model. And I went through this knowing nothing about the existence of AOT at the time, but I used myself and my son as an example. There were 3 times before my son passed in 2010 that I wrote to his psychiatrist, literally begging. And when I say this, I'm not blaming the psychiatrist. I want to be very clear here. But knowing as little as I knew about what rights he had, what rights I had, Norm, to your point, my son willingly, he trusted me, so he would willingly sign a letter that says, my dad is my advocate, you can share whatever information with him. But I went to his psychiatrist 3 times the year before he passed, and I said, my son is in crisis. I don't know what else to do. Can we please hospitalize him at least 30 days so we can get him stable, because he stopped taking his medication. The last time I wrote that letter was 10 days before he passed. Each time I wrote, the first 2 times, each time the response was, until he presents as a risk to self or others. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with that, let's talk about what that really means. What that means is that he had to attempt and fail at taking his own life or somebody else's before we would give him the help that he needed. He had to prove that he could not kill himself before we would help him. What kind of system is that? So again, I'm incredibly grateful to Judge Mack, because in 2016, we got the language change where it said, if a person failed to, self-harm was, the definition was changed to say harm meant that his mental health condition would worsen if he didn't get the help that he needs. So we didn't have to wait for him to physically try to hurt himself or someone else. It's so important that we understand these tools and utilize them. Michigan isn't perfect, but for those folks in Iowa who are asking, I would look to Michigan and see what iterations, again, we've had to go through to improve the law and make it more accessible. And then again, understand that those persons affected still have rights. They have a right to a hearing. And in Michigan, we go through the probate, you can go through probate court. And so the person has a right to hearing, has a right to counsel. We do everything I think we can reasonably again, to protect their civil liberties. But I will say this to you, I would rather, if my son disagreed, I'd rather he'd still be alive today to disagree with me, because my son succeeded on his first suicide attempt. And I remember the date my son took his life on June 27th, which was a Sunday. That Monday morning, I was at a psychiatrist's office with a letter. My last letter had 2 sentences. And I said, you can disregard my last because he's dead now. And I didn't have a chance to save him.
I'm so sorry. I would like to add a comment to the family members that are looking to what to do. What I would advise you to do is contact NAMI, contact OCA. They tend to know most about the resources available throughout the whole state, and find the providers that will listen and find a way to help, versus the providers that throw their hands up in the air and say, we're sorry, your son or your daughter won't take their meds, there's nothing we can do. Avoid those people like the plague, and find the people that are working to problem solve and get creative with their funding solutions and ways to give treatment as opposed to stopping treatment. Keep fighting it, and by all means, email providers whenever you can to advocate. I've sent many of those begging emails. Heather, do you have another question? I see it's 1:23, so we've got 7 minutes left.
Yeah, this is probably going to be our last question. I did want to, we concentrated a lot on family members, and that's extremely important. I did want to just put out there for the healthcare providers who may be wondering about that as well, with the, I'm sorry, it was friendly faces, that, you know, a lot of it is also not necessarily dependent on Iowa law. It's dependent on your agency's policies as to whether you can be a signatory on that commitment affidavit or application. So if you're wondering about that, I would say check with your agency or an employer, because they do want, they do have to be concerned that their providers keep a, you know, keep a good relationship with their clients in order to keep serving them too. So, really quickly, there's a message from somebody who works in a prison where needed commitment orders are generally maintained long-term. Their observation is that assisted outpatient gets dropped most of the time, and in short order as soon as the patient with severe debilitating illness releases from prison to the community. What incentives for providers, insurers, and courts could be explored to maintain assisted outpatient long-term for those patients?
Really quickly, here in Michigan, you can secure an AOT order while a person is still incarcerated. You can also secure an AOT order while a person is still in the hospital. AOT orders in Michigan last for up to 180 days, the initial order, and that order can be renewed for up to a year if necessary, and can include hospitalization if necessary. And so our system works a little different, but again, it's taken us 15 years to get here.
Judge McElyea, do you have an answer for that question? Are you aware of that?
I'm not. You know, I think we obviously have some pretty extensive reentry programs for folks when they leave prison, but I'm not aware of what specific programs exist regarding mental health treatment. You know, I think one of the downsides is that when folks are locked up for a significant amount of time, they lose any benefits that they might have as well, and so that probably creates some barriers.
Yeah, and I would say, go ahead, Norm. No,
I would just point out here that the costs of incarceration are enormous, and they are so much greater than the costs of AOT. And one of the things we have to do is pound away at policymakers to understand that if they implemented a long-term AOT program for people, they're going to save a fortune because it keeps people out of prison. So we have to really juggle the way we frame these things, and note that there are many financial incentives. Judge Leifman pointed out that the amount of money that Florida is spending, and that includes his own county, on incarcerating people with serious mental illnesses is enormous. And the amount that they're spending to help people who are out of prison with serious illnesses to stay out of prison is trivial. And if they switch that around, it would result in staggering savings.
I agree. And I would add that, yeah, I wasn't aware of there not being an AOT order when somebody gets out of prison. I was aware that Medicaid cannot be used while somebody is still on probation. And that is very much one of the policies that we advocated directly with all of the presidential candidates, and Kamala Harris put in her plan to change that. So I'm hopeful with a new administration that we will see some progress on that piece of it. But I will follow up to learn more about the AOT order and whether that can or cannot exist when someone's released, because that's something I hadn't known about. And Heather, do we have any other questions, or should I let people have a closing statement?
Well, we just have a couple minutes. And I apologize, that is a hard deadline for me, I'm told by Zach. So really quickly, could you maybe list where in Iowa they have mental health courts of any type?
Sure, I'll start the list, and I'm going to let Judge McElyea help me at the end of the list. I know in Scott County, Story County, Potawatomi, and I'm going to let you help me out with the other two counties.
I know there's one in Wapello, and I'm not sure the other one, and we're trying to expand into Clinton and Muscatine as well.
Yes, and we're trying to get a civil mental health court established in the 6th Judicial District, which includes Johnson and Lynn County. So we're working on that. I'm going to go ahead and just say thank you to all of our panelists. I really appreciate you all sharing your opinions from all of your different experiences. It's a difficult thing for those of us that are family members, so thank you so much for sharing that. I know how hard that is. And I'd like to give you an opportunity in this last 1 minute if any of you would like to make any other points.
Real quickly, I'll go and just say that, again, I thank you for the opportunity to be here. I wish you success in expanding mental health courts and AOT in Iowa. And I saw a comment in one of the chats that talked about people believing that mental health courts are effectively get out of jail free cards. It is not. It is absolutely not. CIT is not hug a thug. AOT courts is not get out of jail free. So just want to put that out, but thank you all for being here.
Yes, thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's been an honor to serve on the panel with everybody. My condolences to our panelists who have dealt with that. It's touched us all in a variety of ways, and I appreciate your candor, and thank you very much.
I would also like to thank everybody, but also especially to thank Leslie for your tireless advocacy here, including with all those presidential candidates. And let's hope that now we have a vice president who's a little more sensitive to it, in part because of what you did, that we may get some action at the national level.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for being here today. We've really enjoyed having you. It's a wonderful discussion. Just want to remind people that probably sometime next week, we will have these sessions available on the website if you feel like you missed anything. I will try to, on some of these questions, I will try to get someone to reach out to you, but just know that you can always call NAMI Iowa if you have questions about any of this. If we don't know, we'll find you someone who does. And our phone number is 515-254-0417, and we are open Monday through Friday, 8:30 to 4:30. You can also email us at info@namiiowa.org. And of course, our website is namiiowa.org. So thank you, everybody. And the next breakout sessions will begin at 1:45. So you have a few minutes to kind of, get what you need and join us for the next sessions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.